The laughter did not begin right away. That was the thing Maggie Holt would remember later. In the years when she let herself remember it at all, there was a moment of silence first. The particular silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that requires them to decide. In the space of a single breath, whose side they are on. Harriet Crane was standing beside the refreshment table in the Larkspur Church Hall, dressed in the kind of blue silk that had no business being in Wyoming in October, speaking in a voice that was perfectly calibrated to reach every corner of the room, without appearing to try. She was not shouting. She would never shout. She had never needed to. Maggie had come through the kitchen doorway with the bread pan, when the words found her. Arrangement. She heard that one clearly. A woman of that particular history. She heard that one too. The bread pan was still warm. She could feel it through the cloth she had folded beneath it. 40 people in the hall, ranchers and their wives, the schoolteacher, the sheriff, the banker's family, the preacher and his wife and the preacher's 2 oldest daughters who had been whispering together all evening and now went very still. All of them watching her. She was aware of them, the way you are aware of a cold wind when there is nowhere to go and no shelter left to reach. She did not cry. She set the bread pan on the table nearest to her. The movement was slow and deliberate. Both hands flat, the cloth straightened where it had folded at the corner. She smoothed it down. Then she turned and walked toward the door. She did not look at Harriet Crane. She did not explain herself. Through the side window, as she passed, she saw Peter Rourke standing alone at the wagon in the cold. He had heard everything. She could see it in the way he was standing, that particular stillness of a 9-year-old boy, who has understood something about the world he did not want to understand. She pushed the door open and walked out into the October air. She did not look back. But that was not where this began. So let's go back all the way to Laramie, Wyoming, 14 months earlier. And a woman standing in a kitchen that was about to stop being hers. If you have ever been in a room where someone tried to make you small, in front of everyone you know. Stay with this story. Drop your city in the comments. Right now, I want to know how far this one travels. Hit like if you've just arrived. And whatever you do, stay until the end. Because that bread pan is not finished yet. And neither is Maggie Holt. Now, Laramie, Wyoming territory. Autumn of 1883, and the last morning she would spend in a kitchen that had never really been hers to begin with. Edmund Holt had been many things to many people. He had been charming to the men at the card tables. He had been apologetic to the men he owed money to. And he had been, in the years of their marriage, a particular kind of husband, the kind who fills a room with intention and empties it with consequence. He had a good laugh and a bad habit of believing his luck was about to turn, and for 12 years Maggie had cooked her way through both. He died on a Tuesday in June, which was also the night he lost $412 to a man named Greer. The order of those 2 events was disputed, depending on who was telling the story. Maggie had stopped asking people to tell it. The order didn't change the amount of the debt. She had worked the kitchen at Dunnigan's boarding house for 6 years. 40 men, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week from October to April and 5 days from April to October when the cattle crews came through, and there were sometimes more than 40. She could feed a full house on 40 cents of supplies, and not one of them would leave the table hungry. That was the truth about Maggie Holt that the town of Laramie knew, and the truth that mattered least to the men standing on her doorstep in July. The first one had been almost polite, the second was not. The third had looked at the kitchen stove and the good copper pots hanging above it and said he could take those instead. By way of a start, which he then proceeded to do, while she stood in the doorway and watched, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would change what was happening. After that, it was the boarding house itself. Dunnigan's nephew arrived from Denver with papers that had Edmund's name on them going back for years before he died. Which told her how far back the trouble ran. And by August, she was cooking in someone else's kitchen for reduced wages, and sleeping in a rented room above the feed store with a bag that was not full, and 1 tin bread pan she had carried for 12 years since her mother died and left her nothing else worth taking. The pan was dented at the right side, where it had dropped once. Scorched at one corner from a kitchen fire years back. initialed inside the rim in letters stamped there by her mother's hand before hers. M.H. It was the only thing with her name on it that no one had been able to reach. In September, her friend May Coulter brought the territorial paper to the rooming house, and sat down on the end of the bed, and spread it on the blanket, and set her finger on a small advertisement in the lower right column. Cook wanted. Rourke's Fork Ranch. Bighorn Foothills, Wyoming Territory, steady work, October start, references not required. Those last 3 words. May said, "Maggie, look at those last 3 words." Maggie looked at them. She knew about references. She already knew what they would say in Laramie if anyone with pen and paper asked. Edmund Holt's widow. The gambling debts. That particular situation. The word arrangement was already being used by people who had not been there and did not know her and were going to use it regardless. And she had not done anything to earn it, except survive her husband's decisions. Which was apparently enough. She read the advertisement again. She folded the paper. She told May she would think about it. She thought about it for the better part of one evening. Sitting in the feed storeroom with the bread pan on the windowsill and the sounds of Laramie going about its business below, what she was thinking was simple enough. There was nothing in Laramie she owed a goodbye to. There was a debt of $412 she could not pay from here in any number of years, at reduced wages in someone else's kitchen. And there were 3 words at the bottom of a newspaper advertisement that were the first 3 words that had felt like a door rather than a wall in longer than she could immediately recall. She wrote 1 letter and posted it the next morning. 18 days later, a reply came back. 2 sentences in a handwriting that was unhurried and plain. The way the handwriting of a man who doesn't write more than necessary tends to be. The position is available. Come on the stage. That arrives the first week of October. No name at the bottom. Just a date. She packed her bag in under 20 minutes. She put the bread pan in last. Wrapped in her spare dress. She left the room key on the windowsill. She did not look back at Laramie. She was getting good at not looking back. The stage north to Bighorn Country took 2 days and stopped at relay stations that varied in their hospitality from barely adequate to genuinely bleak. Maggie did not mind. She had her bag between her feet and a window she could see the territory from. And she had left before dawn so as not to run into anyone on her way out of town. Which had worked, and that was sufficient. The country changed on the 2nd day. That was what she noticed most. The flatlands gave way to foothills, and the horizon went from wide and empty to something more complicated, ridgelines and timber, and a sky that sat closer somehow, as though it had come down for a better look at what was happening below it. She watched it out the window and thought about nothing she had been thinking about for the past 3 months. That was a relief. That was, in fact, considerable. Rourke's Fork was not on any map she had seen. It lay 4 miles east of a crossroads settlement called Larkspur, which had a church and a general store and a saloon, and a church again mentioned in the supply company's notes, as if to balance the saloon out. The ranch itself was reached by a rutted road that climbed into the foothills through stands of aspen gone gold in the October air until the trees opened and a valley spread out below 600 acres of grass and Winterpale Creek bottom, with a stream running through the center of it and, at the top of a low rise, a house. It was a good house, that was her first thought, and she had learned to trust first thoughts about houses. 2 stories, solid timber. A wide porch with a bench on the left side worn down by years of use. Smoke coming from the kitchen chimney in the early afternoon in a way that meant someone knew what they were doing with a stove. The barn was built straight. The fences were kept. She had spent enough years in other people's houses to know that you could tell a great deal about who lived in a place by whether they fixed what was broken before it became something else. The wagon driver set her bag on the ground and turned the team around, and left without unnecessary conversation, which she appreciated. She picked up the bag and walked to the house. A woman appeared in the doorway before Maggie reached the porch steps. Older, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had made a permanent peace with what it looked like and moved on to things that mattered more. "You'll be the cook," the woman said. "I will. Dora Alcott. I run the house. Mr. Rourke runs everything else." A brief pause. like a period at the end of a sentence that required nothing further. Come in and let me show you the kitchen. The kitchen was large and well built and needed work. Good cast iron stove, a work table with room enough to do real things on. 3 windows that would catch the morning light in the right season. The shelves required considerably more than they currently held. Maggie did a rapid inventory without appearing to. A skill developed across years of walking into other people's kitchens and measuring the distance between what she had been led to expect and what was actually there. The flour sack was nearly empty. The salt was low. No lard. Potatoes, 2 strings of dried beans. A side of salt pork that needed using soon. A tin of coffee whose date of purchase she would have to determine by smell before she could rely on it for anything. She set her bag on the chair by the door and turned to Dora. I'll need a supply run before I can do proper work. Dora regarded her with the expression of someone who had heard that kind of sentence before and was not yet committed to believing it led anywhere useful. Mr. Rourke can arrange the wagon. You'll speak to him about the household account. When does he come in? Dark. Maggie looked at the work table, and then at the stove, and then at the bottom shelf where the lard tin sat scrubbed clean and empty. Is there a list already made, or do I start from what I find? Something shifted in Dora's expression, slight, assessing. Start from what you find, she said. See what you make of it. She made biscuits. Flour and salt and the last tablespoon of lard she found at the very back of the empty tin and the milk from the good cow, the reliable one whose stall she had already identified on her way past the barn. It was a minimal operation performed from memory, with no hesitation. She had them on the table by 4 in the afternoon while there was still an hour of light left. Not to feed anyone yet. To have the house smell like something. The twins came down the back stairs, at the smell. She had not known they were in the house. She turned from the stove and found them standing in the kitchen doorway. 2 of them, identical faces, dark hair, 9 years old. Watching her with the careful attentiveness of children who have made a practice of not expecting things. One had dirt on his left hand and something charcoal dark on the right. The kind that comes from drawing with burnt wood or coal. The other stood straight and kept his hands at his sides and said nothing. She did not make a fuss over them. She had learned in years of cooking in houses with children that the fastest way to earn a child's trust was to treat them as if they were already old enough to have it. There are biscuits, she said. If you want them. The one with the charcoal hands looked at the pan on the table, then at her. Then he crossed to the table, took a biscuit, and sat in the chair against the wall. The other one followed. Neither spoke. She turned back to the stove and let them eat in peace. Caleb Rourke came in at dark. She heard him first, boots on the porch. The sound of a man who moves through a space without announcing himself. Who takes exactly the room he needs and no more. Then the back door. And he was in the kitchen. And she turned from the stove. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing. Broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who has worked with his body every day of his adult life, and has the posture to show for it. Dark hair with silver beginning at the temples. A face that had at some point been easy to read and had since been arranged into something considerably harder to access, not cold. Not unkind, but set, the way a door is set into a frame and requires real effort to open. He looked at her with the quick assessment of a man who processes information efficiently and reveals nothing about what he's doing with it. You're the cook, he said. Maggie Holt. Caleb Rourke. He looked at the boys against the wall. Something moved across his face and was gone. They giving you trouble? No trouble. He looked at the biscuits on the table and then at the stove, and then back at her. And she had the sense of being evaluated against an unstated standard, in the same brisk way she had evaluated his kitchen. And she thought, from the slight shift in his posture, that she was not coming up short. Dora tell you the terms? She did. He nodded once. That appeared to be the end of the interview. He took his coat off and hung it on the peg by the door, and went through to the main room, and she heard the creak of a chair accepting his weight. She turned back to the stove. She thought, well, he'll do. She did not examine those particular words too closely. The first week was about learning the ranch the way you learn any new place, by being wrong about things several times and correcting yourself before anyone noticed. She found where Dora kept the account books and where the supply shed was, and which of the 2 milk cows was reliable, and which had opinions. She found a garden plot that had been put in and then let go, and spent a cold afternoon pulling it back, because there were 2 rows of carrots in it that could still be saved before the hard frost came down. Dora watched her do this from the kitchen window, but said nothing about it. The next morning there were 2 new flour sacks on the shelf and a tin of good coffee she had not seen before. Neither item had been there the night before. No explanation was offered. She did not ask for one. She used the flour. The boys came and went in rhythms she was still learning. Peter, the one with the charcoal hands, came into the kitchen before dawn on the 4th morning. The bread was already in. Real loaves now that the flour had arrived. And the kitchen was warm and smelled the way a kitchen ought to smell before the sun is up. He sat at the table without asking permission. She let him. After a while he said, "What's that pan?" She was at the work table with her back to him. "Which one?" "That old one. Up on the shelf." He meant the tin bread pan. She had set it there on her first morning. Her habit from 12 years of kitchens, above the stove, where the warmth kept it dry, and where she could see it while she worked. "It was my mother's," she said. "What do those letters mean? M.H. Same initials as me." He was quiet for a moment. She shaped the second loaf and did not turn around. The boys had not asked for anything in a long time. Dora had told her this in the first 2 days. In that matter-of-fact way Dora delivered the important things, as though they were ordinary. Their mother died 2 Octobers past. Fever, 2 days from first symptom to the end. Since then they mostly keep to themselves and don't ask for much of anything. "My mother's dead," Peter said. "I know." She set the loaf in the pan and slid it toward the oven. "Mine too." She turned around. He was looking at the bread pan on the shelf, working out something in his expression the way children do when they are deciding whether a piece of information is sad or simply true. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "That's my plan," she said. He nodded once. The nod of a person who has needed a specific answer and has now received it, and is filing it somewhere safe. Then he went back upstairs, and she listened to his feet on the steps, and she turned back to the stove. She put one hand on the edge of the work table. She stood there a moment in the warm kitchen in the dark before dawn, and looked at the bread in the oven, and thought about nothing she could put a name to exactly. One day, then the next. The Cranes came on a Friday, 2 weeks after she arrived. She did not know they were coming. She found out the way she found out most things at Rourke's by hearing horses on the road, and looking out the kitchen window, in time to see a hired buggy coming up the rise with a woman in blue silk on the right side, and a broad-shouldered man in a town coat on the left, the kind of coat that had been made by someone who charged for the making. Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her expression had complicated itself. "Sylvester Crane," she said, "and his wife Harriet. He's been trying to get the East pasture land since spring. Railroad right-of-way. Does Mr. Rourke want to sell?" "No." Dora paused. "He hasn't said so in those particular words. He doesn't use words he doesn't need. But no." Maggie looked back out the window. Harriet Crane was stepping down from the buggy, in the way of a woman who was accustomed to being helped, and was already composing her disappointment at the quality of assistance available. She wore her hair in the fashion of a larger city, and her coat was cut close. And she moved across the yard with the deliberate unhurry of someone who knew that other people adjusted their pace to accommodate hers. Then Harriet's eyes went to the kitchen window. For half a second, no more. They met Maggie's through the glass. Maggie held the look. She did not look away first. Harriet Crane's gaze moved on, as if Maggie were part of the window frame itself. As if she were furniture. As if she were something that had been noticed, measured, categorized, and filed under a heading that had not yet been opened. Not yet. Maggie went back to the stove and stirred what was on it, and said nothing. But that word stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon, turning over quietly in the back of her thoughts while she worked. Yet. The crane visit lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Maggie knew this because she was in the kitchen for all of it, and the kitchen was separated from the parlor by one interior wall and a door that did not fit its frame well enough to stop sound from traveling in either direction. She was not listening deliberately. She was making a soup from the salt pork and the last of the saved carrots and a handful of dried sage she had found at the very back of a shelf. And the nature of the work required her to stay at the stove. And the nature of the wall required her to hear. Sylvester Crane had a voice built for larger rooms than parlors. He used it accordingly. He spoke about the railroad with the particular confidence of a man who believed that the value of an idea was proportional to the volume at which it was delivered. Right of way, survey crews, compensation figures that climbed as the conversation went on, as if the numbers themselves were negotiating upward. Caleb Rourke said 7 words in the 2 hours and 20 minutes, Maggie counted, not on purpose, but because the silences between them were long enough that each word was distinct. The first 3 words were, "I'll think on it." The next 2 were, "Not yet." The last 2. At the sound of chairs moving, and a visit concluding, "Good day," she heard Harriet Crane's voice only twice. Once to decline coffee, a brief, correct refusal with no explanation offered, which told Maggie that the coffee itself was not the point of the refusal, and once, near the end, when the footsteps moved toward the front door and paused, and Harriet said something she could not fully hear, low and bright and polished, the way a coin is polished before it is presented. Whatever it was meant for Caleb to carry with him after the buggy drove away. She stirred the soup. She heard the front door close. She heard boots on the floorboards going to the window. Then stopping. A long silence. Then the back door opened and she heard Caleb cross the porch toward the barn. And then there was only the stove, and the soup, and the carrots going soft in the pot. Dora came into the kitchen shortly after and stood at the shelf, straightening things that did not need straightening. "What did she say at the door?" Maggie asked. Dora did not pretend to misunderstand the question. That the ranch would look well with a proper household. Maggie kept her eyes on the soup. "What did he say to that?" "Nothing." Dora set a tin straight. "He doesn't answer things that don't deserve an answer." Maggie thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. And then she put it aside, because the soup needed salt and the bread was due out of the oven and there was a kitchen to run. One day, then the next. Thomas Rourke, she learned, did not come to things directly. He came to them the way weather comes. You did not always see it approaching. And by the time you understood what was happening, it had already arrived and was simply there. Peter was the one who spoke first, who asked about the bread pan, who came down the stairs at 4:30 in the morning, because he could not stay away from the smell of bread baking. Thomas moved differently. He appeared at the edge of things, watching, with the focused attention of a boy cataloging everything for a purpose he had not yet explained. The first week, she found him sitting on the porch when she came out to bring water from the pump. He did not say hello. He watched her work the pump handle and carry the bucket back, and he did not offer to help. But the second morning he was there again, and the third morning he was already at the pump before she reached it. He handed her the full bucket without comment and went back to the porch and sat down. The fourth morning there were 2 buckets. She said thank you the first time, and he shrugged in the way of a boy who has done something helpful and is not sure what to do with acknowledgement. And she did not make more of it than it was, which was apparently the correct approach, because he kept doing it. At supper on the 8th night, he took a second helping. She noticed because she was the one serving, and she noticed it the way you notice a thing that has not happened before and is therefore a signal of something. He had been eating. She knew from Dora, since his mother's death, the minimum that a child needs to eat, and no more. He had not done it from unhappiness, or from stubbornness, or from the kind of deliberate diminishment that children sometimes use to express grief. He had done it, Dora said, simply because wanting things seemed to have gone out of him when Clara went. The boys had not asked for anything in a long time. He took the second helping with his fork without looking up from his plate, the same way he had handed her the bucket without comment, as if this were something that had always been going to happen and had finally arrived at its scheduled time. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table with her hands flat on the scrubbed wood and listened to the sound of a spoon against a tin plate in the next room, and felt something that was too large to look at directly and too specific to ignore.
She put water on for coffee and let the feeling be whatever it was going to be. Dora told her about Clara on a Tuesday in the third week of November.
It came the way the important things came from Dora, without preamble, without sentimentality, in the plain voice of a woman who had had 15 years of practice carrying a household's history and had decided that Maggie was now entitled to it.
They were in the kitchen in the late afternoon, the light going early the way it did in November, the stove putting out enough warmth to make the room feel insulated from the dark coming in the windows.
Maggie was making biscuits. Dora was doing the week's accounts at the far end of the table. Clara was strong, Dora said, without looking up from the ledger.
Not in a delicate way. The real kind.
She could handle the ranch books and the children and the kitchen garden and a bad horse all in the same week and come out ahead on all of them. Maggie worked the dough without turning around. She knew this kind of telling. You do not interrupt it, and you do not prompt it. You make yourself steady at whatever you are doing. And you listen. October 2 years ago. Dora said. She was fine on a Monday. Not fine by Wednesday. Gone by Saturday morning. A pause in which Maggie heard the soft sound of a pencil being set down. 2 days between a fever that seemed ordinary and the end of it. The doctor came from Larkspur. He was here for the last 12 hours. But there was nothing to be done by then. Maggie pressed her palms into the biscuit dough. She said nothing. Caleb came out of the bedroom that Saturday morning and he went straight to the barn. He was in there for 4 hours.
I don't know what he did in there. When he came out he went to the field and did 4 hours of fence work that didn't need doing. A brief pause.
He hasn't been in her bedroom since the day of the funeral. That room is closed. The dough was ready. Maggie began cutting it. The boys were 7. Dora said. Thomas didn't speak for 6 weeks after, not because he couldn't, because he had decided there was nothing he wanted to say. She was quiet for a moment. He started again in December. First word was his father's name. He called out to him across the yard. Caleb stopped walking.
He turned around.
He didn't say anything either, but he waited until Thomas reached him, and then they walked to the barn together. Maggie set the cut biscuits on the pan. She ran her thumb along the rim of the tin bread pan automatically. The familiar groove of the dent. The warmth of the oven-heated metal. He's a good man, Dora said. It was not offered as praise. It was stated, the way you state a fact, about geography. The mountain is north. The water is cold. Caleb Rourke is a good man. I know, Maggie said. She heard Dora pick up the pencil and go back to the accounts. That was all.
That was the whole of it.
Delivered and received and folded away into the kitchen in the late November afternoon. And neither of them mentioned it again, because some things, once said, are simply part of the room, from then on. The evenings had developed their own architecture. She had noticed it happening, the way you notice a road being made by the same feet walking the same ground gradually. Then, obviously, then something you no longer thought to remark on. After supper was cleared and the boys had gone to their room and Dora had gone to her own by 9, Caleb stayed at the kitchen table with his stock ledgers spread out in front of him, going through the numbers in the lamplight with the focused silence of a man for whom the work is also the company.
She had begun, somewhere in the 3rd week, to stay as well mending at the far end of the table, or going over the household accounts that were now hers to manage, or simply sitting with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone only slightly cold.
They did not talk through these evenings in any sustained way. They were not that kind of people, either of them. They said what needed saying, and left the rest alone. And the space between sentences was not uncomfortable. It was, she had come to understand, a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill the air between themselves with proof that they are worth listening to.
On a Wednesday in late November, he said, without looking up from the ledger.
Peter talks to you. He does. He talked to Clara the same way, constant.
A pause.
Something moving through his expression that she did not try to read. He went about 6 weeks without much of it. After. She looked at her mending.
He told me about his mother. What did he say? That she was dead.
She set the mending down and looked at him across the table. He said it the way you say something true that you've already made your peace with. Caleb looked at the ledger. His jaw moved slightly. The kind of movement that means a man is working through something that does not have an exterior. He's not wrong, he said finally. The lamp between them put a warm circle on the table. And outside the November wind was making the house work for its warmth. And the stove answered steadily, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. She picked up the mending. He went back to the numbers. The boys had not asked for anything in a long time, but that was changing. She could feel it, the way you feel a season changing, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The light at a different angle, the air carrying something new. She thought about that. Sitting at the far end of Caleb Rourke's kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she thought it carefully, because she was a woman who had learned to be careful with things she could not afford to lose. The Cranes came back in December. She heard the buggy on the road on a Thursday afternoon and felt the same quality of attention she had felt the first time, not alarm, exactly, something more like the awareness of a weather shift. Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway without being called. Same business, Dora said. The survey crew found something on the east pasture that made the railroad company more interested. The figures went up. Maggie went on with what she was doing, which was preparing the supper that would be ready at 6 whether the Cranes were still here or not. This visit was longer. She heard Harriet's voice more than the first time, which told her that the negotiation had a different quality. Sylvester was applying the money, and Harriet was applying something else. Some additional pressure that required more words. She could not make out the specifics. She concentrated on the stove. Then she heard Caleb Rourke's voice, which was unusual enough that she went still. He did not raise it. He never raised it. She had already learned that about him. But it had gone to a particular quietness. Not the ordinary quietness of a man who uses words economically, but the quietness of a man who has reached the end of something and has decided to be very precise about where that end is. She could make out 4 words. She will not be. Then Sylvester's voice, lower, a word she didn't catch. And then Caleb again, good day, Mr. Crane. The visit ended. She heard the front door. The buggy on the gravel. The particular silence of a house after unwanted company has departed. She kept her hands on the work table and looked at the wall and did not turn around. Dora appeared again in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. Her expression was careful and satisfied in the way of a woman who has seen something confirmed. What did he say? Maggie asked. Sylvester made a comment about the arrangement. The word came out of Dora's mouth the way she'd have handled something found on the bottom of her boot, about you living under this roof and what that suggested, and how a man in Caleb's position ought to be mindful of appearances. Maggie was very still. What did Caleb say? She will not be spoken about in that way under her own roof. The sentence sat in the kitchen between them. Under her own roof. Dora looked at Maggie and Maggie looked at Dora, and neither of them said another word about it. Because there was no word that needed adding. She turned back to the stove. She kept her expression where she needed it to be, which was where she had learned to keep it composed, present, attending to the work. She did not let herself look at the thing he had said directly. The way you do not look at something bright when you need to go on seeing clearly. Under her own roof. She did not explain herself. To the stove. To the soup. To the kitchen that was beginning to know the particular rhythm of her. She did not explain what that sentence did to the lock thing she had been keeping for 3 months at the very back of where she kept things. She put the bread in and closed the oven and stood there with one hand on the door. One day, she thought. Then the next. December came down from the mountains, with the particular seriousness of a Wyoming winter that has stopped making overtures and has begun to mean it. The temperature dropped in the first week and kept dropping. The creek at the bottom of the valley froze in sections and then all at once, and the roads went hard and the stock required more. And Caleb's hours stretched out at either end of the day, out before she was up. In after the boys were in bed. Lamplight going in the barn until 8 or 9 most nights, when she could see it from the kitchen window. When she went to check the damper on the stove, she began leaving a covered plate in the warming shelf above the oven. He did not comment on this the first time.
He did not comment on it the second time. The third time he came in late and found it there. He paused in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he crossed to the shelf, and she was already in the hallway, by then, on her way to bed. And he said, without fully turning around, "Thank you." 2 words. She had been counting. "You're welcome," she said, and went to her room and shut the door. She lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let herself think, just briefly, about the covered plate and the warming shelf and the 2 words, and what it meant that she had started doing the thing before he'd asked for it, and he had accepted it without making more of it than it was. And she thought, well, there it is. Then she turned over and went to sleep. She was not, she had decided some time ago, going to be foolish about this. She was a 38-year-old widow with a complicated name in a valley that was still making up its mind about her. And she had been foolish before, in the ways that cost the most. And she was not going to do it again. But she could allow herself the fact of the thing without being foolish about it. That was a distinction she had worked out over the autumn and was now applying with the same precision she applied to everything else. She liked him. He was a good man and a fair employer. And he spoke plainly and he said what he meant and did not say what he didn't. And in her experience, which was extensive on this particular subject, that was rarer than it should have been. She was allowed to like him. She was not allowed to need it. There was a difference. And she knew it. And she held the line between them carefully. Thomas Rourke made the line somewhat more difficult to hold on the last Wednesday of December. She had come into the kitchen in the early morning, not yet 4:30, the house still entirely dark. She built the stove up first and then turned to the work table to set out the bread materials. And there was something on the bread pan. She stopped. It was a piece of brown paper, folded in half, slid beneath the tin bread pan precisely so that it was held in place, rather than left loose. She lifted the pan, unfolded the paper. It was a drawing. Not a rough sketch, not the quick marks of a child barely trying. He had taken his time, in charcoal, with real attention to the weight and shading of it. A horse, head slightly turned, looking out from the page. It was good. It was genuinely good, in a way that made you understand something about the boy who had made it. He had been watching horses with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And he had put what he saw here on the paper, with the kind of honesty that is only possible when no one has told you yet what you're supposed to do differently. In the corner of the drawing, very small, the initials T.R. She set the bread pan back down. She smoothed the paper flat with the heel of her hand. She propped it against the wall beside the pan, where the morning light from the east window would reach it first. She stood there a moment in the kitchen before the house was awake, in the warmth of the stove already building, with the drawing of the horse against the wall, and the bread pan beside it, and December outside pressing at the windows. And she thought about a 9-year-old boy who had carried charcoal in his pocket, and worked at something carefully in the dark, and slid it under her bread pan with his initials in the corner, and gone back to bed. The boys had not asked for anything in a long time, but he had given her something. She was not going to think too carefully about what that meant. She folded her sleeves up and began measuring flour. Peter appeared at the bottom of the stairs at 4:45. As usual, drawn by the smell, he sat in his chair and looked at the drawing propped against the wall. "Thomas did that," he said. "I know, he was up late." Peter studied the horse. "He did 3 of them before he got it right." She mixed the dough. "Did he?" "He wanted it to look real." Peter pulled his knees up to the chair. "He said if it didn't look real, it wasn't worth giving." She looked at the drawing. The horse looked real. The horse looked exactly like itself. "Tell him," she said, "that it's the best horse I've ever had in my kitchen." Peter nodded with the solemnity of a boy who has been given a message of consequence and intends to deliver it correctly. He took a biscuit from the cloth where she'd left the ones from the evening before, and ate it in 4 bites and climbed the stairs, and was gone. She stood at the work table with her hands in the dough and the drawing on the wall, and the stove going strong and the dark outside the windows just beginning, to consider the possibility of lifting. She was not going to need it. She was not going to let herself need it. But in the honest part of herself,
the part that could not be managed into keeping quiet no matter how well she tried, she thought.
You are already failing at that. Margaret Holt, you have been failing at it for some time. January arrived and the cold became something you did not argue with. You accommodated it the way you accommodate facts, by adjusting your operations accordingly and saving your opinions for matters you could actually influence.
Maggie wore 2 layers from the moment she rose and moved fast from the house to the outbuildings to keep the cold from having time to settle in.
And she stopped using the side door entirely,
because the gap in the frame let in a draft that followed her to the stove.
and she stuffed it with a strip of canvas she found in the supply shed, and that solved it. Caleb noticed the canvas. He said nothing about it in her presence.
But she came around the corner of the house 3 mornings later and found him redoing the door frame from the outside in a more permanent way with a planer
And new weather stripping. Working methodically in a cold that made his breath visible. His coat on and buttoned. The tools set out in the order he would use them.
She went inside and made coffee. When he came in, she set it on the table and went back to the stove. "Draft's been bothering you," he said.
Not a question. Not an apology. A statement that acknowledged what he had seen and what he had done about it.
"Better now," she said.
He drank the coffee and went back out.
The boys had not asked for anything in a long time. But Thomas had taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway in the mornings with his sketchbook under his arm, and she had stopped asking why he came, and he had stopped looking like he expected to be sent away.
And they existed in the kitchen together in the morning light, in a way that did not require explanation from either of them. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January, without any particular preamble, he sat down at the work table and opened the sketchbook and drew while she worked. She let him. He came back the next day. And the day after.
On the 5th day, she set a biscuit beside his elbow while he was drawing, and he ate it without looking up. And she went back to her work and
thought, this is how it happens. Not all at once. One day, then the next. And then one morning you look up from the stove and find that you have put down roots in ground you had only meant to rest in. And the roots have gone deep. And the ground has accepted them. And there is nothing to be done about it now except to see what grows.
February came in quiet and stayed that way. The deep cold held through the first 2 weeks, the kind that does not permit argument. And then, in the 3rd week, something shifted in the quality of the air. Not warmth, yet nothing so definitive,
but a suggestion that the cold was considering its options and had not yet fully committed to staying.
Maggie noticed it the morning she went to the pump and did not need her 2nd pair of gloves. Small things. The body registers them before the mind does.
The ranch had its own signals for the turning of a season. She had been there 4 months and she was learning them. The cattle moved differently when the cold began to ease, spreading out from the winter, clustering near the south fence and venturing toward the creek. The horses stood at the paddock rail in the morning with their heads higher. Caleb came in from his rounds in the evenings a few minutes earlier. Which was, she had come to understand, not because the days were longer yet, but because there was slightly less emergency out there demanding his attention. He was not an easy man to know. She had accepted this somewhere in December and stopped expecting it to change. And the acceptance had made things considerably simpler. He moved through the ranch with a kind of concentrated purposefulness that left very little room for the kinds of conversation that are primarily about the comfort of having them. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. When he didn't speak, it was not a closed door. It was simply the truth of what he was. A man who had used silence as currency for so long that he had lost track of when he had started. She recognized it. She had her own version of the same condition. What she had not been prepared for was the March evening when Thomas came into the kitchen with his sketchbook and sat at the work table, as he had been doing for 2 months now, and opened to a new page and began to draw. And she looked over from the stove and saw what he was drawing. Her, at the stove, from the angle of someone sitting at the work table, looking left. He had caught something she had not known was visible, the set of her shoulders while she was working, the slight tilt of her head when she was listening for whether the bread was ready. The sketch was 3/4 complete when she looked, and she looked away quickly and went back to what she was doing. She did not say anything. He did not show it to her. He closed the sketchbook when he was done and tucked it under his arm, and went upstairs.
She stood at the stove after he'd gone and put one hand flat on the warming surface beside the oven, not because she needed steadying,
but because the warmth was steady and she wanted to touch something that was. Caleb had come in from the evening round while Thomas was still drawing. He had seen.
She knew he had seen, because there was a particular quality to how he'd moved to his chair and opened the stock ledger.
The way a man moves when he is being careful not to draw attention to what he has just noticed. He went over the numbers for an hour. She made coffee. He accepted it.
They sat at either end of the table in the lamplight, with the sound of the wind working at the eaves, and neither of them remarked on the drawing.
And both of them were thinking about it.
He hasn't drawn people before, Caleb said, not looking up from the ledger. The way he said things that mattered sideways as if the sentence had arrived while he was occupied with something else. The horses are very good, Maggie said. They are. A pause. He's been different this winter. She looked at the far wall. Different how? Less. He seemed to search for the word. Held in, he turned a page in the ledger. He's been held in since October 2 years ago. Tight, like a... He stopped.
He was not a man who used like, she had noticed. He stated things or he didn't. He laughed at supper last week. He said instead, first time in a long time. Peter made a face at him and he laughed. She said nothing. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I heard it from the hall. Caleb said, I stopped walking. He closed the ledger. That's all, he said, meaning I have said the thing I was going to say, and it is complete. He stood up and said good night and went to bed. She stayed at the table a while longer in the lamplight, with the coffee growing cold. And she looked at the far end of the table where he had been, and she thought you are already failing at that. Margaret Holt, you have been failing at it for some time. But she did not look away from the thought. She let it stand in the kitchen with her. Then she banked the stove and went to bed. Spring arrived in April with the particular dishonesty of Wyoming Spring's 1 week of something that resembled warmth, followed by a final week of snow that felt personal. And then in May, a genuine turning over of the weather. The aspens coming into leaf on the lower slopes and the creek running loud and brown with the melt. The ranch expanded in May, that was the word she kept returning to. Everything expanded. Caleb's hours in the field increased, but the urgency in them was different from winter's urgency, less emergency, more forward motion. The boys were outside from dawn to dark, and came in smelling of creek water and horse, and the particular outdoor smell of children who have been doing exactly what they were built to do. Peter brought her a frog on a Tuesday, held in both hands, to show her the engineering of it, then released it in the yard. Thomas brought her a charcoal drawing of the creek from the north bank. She propped it against the wall beside the first one. The horse. The collection grew. She did not remark on it. The boys did not remark on it. The wall beside the bread pan filled slowly across the spring, with horses and the barn, and the valley, and Dora's hands doing the accounts, and the view from the upstairs window on a clear day. She came in one morning in late May to find a new one. Not horses this time. Not landscape. The bread pan itself, drawn close and precise. The dent rendered with particular attention. The scorched corner. The initials, M, H, visible inside the rim. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she went to make bread. The boys had not asked for anything in a long time, but they had given her things. Quietly, by increments. In the careful way of children who are not yet certain their gifts are wanted but cannot stop making them. And she had not told them to stop. And they had not stopped. That was its own kind of asking. The Cranes made their third visit in June. This one was different. There was no pretense of the social call that had covered the first two. Sylvester Crane arrived alone, without Harriet, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and he sat in Caleb's parlor for 40 minutes, with papers and a company representative from the railroad, who had the look of a man accustomed to applying productive pressure to unwilling sellers. Maggie stayed in the kitchen. Dora appeared and disappeared and appeared again with the expression she wore when she was monitoring something through methods she preferred not to detail. The company man left first. Then Sylvester. Alone on the porch with Caleb for 5 minutes, the conversation low and final sounding. When the buggy had gone, Caleb came through the kitchen without stopping and went straight out to the barn. And the door closed behind him with a quietness that meant he was managing something she did not need to see. Dora appeared.
The offer doubled. She said, Maggie was making the bread. He said no. Dora added, I know. Dora sat down at the table.
She was quiet for a moment.
Harriet sent a letter last week, she said. To Larkspur, to some of the families there. She said it in the tone she used for information that required careful handling. I don't know what was in it, but I know letters went out. Maggie pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. When is the harvest social? She asked. First Saturday of October. Maggie said nothing.
She turned the dough and worked it in silence. And she thought about letters going to Laramie for a woman who knew how to use what she found there. She thought about the word arrangement and the woman who could use it most precisely. She thought about what Harriet Crane had filed away in October of the previous year. In that single, half-second inventory through the kitchen window. She had known this was coming. She had known it since that first look. She went on making the bread. One day, she thought. Then the next.
Summer moved through the ranch the way good summers do. Generously, slowly, with a quality of expansion that makes the days feel larger than they are.
Caleb hired 2 additional hands for the summer work, and the yard was busier, and the kitchen ran at a different scale.
And Maggie ran it the way she had run larger operations, methodically, without complaint. With the particular economy of a woman who knows how to make 40 cents of supplies feed a hungry room.
The hands were respectful. She was efficient and plain with them, and they understood the terms quickly.
By June they had learned not to come into the kitchen without reason, and by July they had learned that there was always something in the warming shelf above the oven if they came in from a long day and had missed supper. Which meant they had also learned not to miss supper, which solved 2 problems simultaneously. Dora watched all of this with the expression of a woman watching something she had waited a considerable time to see.
In July, on a warm evening when the boys were in the yard still, and the hands were at the bunkhouse, and Dora had gone to bed early with the headache she got in the heat. Caleb came in from his rounds and found the kitchen empty and Maggie on the porch in the last of the light. She was sitting on the bench, the one on the left side, worn down by years of use. She had not sat there before. She had passed it twice a day for 9 months and had never sat down. He came through the door and stopped. She looked up. I hope that's all right, she said.
The bench. He sat down on the far end of it. It's your porch as much as it is mine.
She looked out at the valley. The light was going gold over the western ridgeline,
and the aspens on the slope were still in the warm air, and the creek at the bottom of the valley
was low and quiet.
I used to have a porch, she said. At the boarding house. Smaller than this. You could only sit sideways and you had to share it with whoever was coming out to smoke.
She paused.
But you could see the street. Did you like it? I liked having something to look at that wasn't work. She said it without self-pity.
Just the fact of it.
In 6 years I went out to that porch every night that wasn't raining and sat for 20 minutes before bed and then went back in.
By yourself.
Edmund didn't sit still well. She looked at the valley. He was a man who needed noise to feel like things were going well. Quiet made him anxious.
Caleb said nothing. Beside her the bench held his weight without shifting. He wasn't a bad man, she said.
Which was a sentence she had said to herself many times and was saying aloud for the first time, to this particular person, on this particular evening.
He was just. He had a very large space inside him, where he needed things to fill it.
And he never found the right things to fill it with.
She looked at her hands in her lap.
And the things he chose instead they had costs. That you paid, Caleb said. She turned to look at him.
The evening light was behind him,
and his face was harder to read in it. Yes, she said. He looked at the valley. A long quiet passed between them.
Not the kitchen quiet. Not the working quiet.
Something different. The kind of quiet that has made a little more room than usual. Clara used to sit on this bench, he said. Every evening she could, said it was the only 20 minutes of the day that belonged to just her. Maggie looked at the bench under her. She would have liked you, he said. Not easily said, she could hear what it cost him to say it. Plainly and directly, the way he said everything that cost him something.
She turned back to the valley. The last light was leaving the tops of the aspen.
"I hope so," she said. They sat there until the light was gone. October came. The harvest social at the Larkspur Church was the social event of the valley year. And the entire Bighorn Foothills community turned out for it.
Ranching families and townspeople, and the schoolteacher and the doctor and the preacher, and his wife, and the banker, and his daughters,
and anyone else within reasonable distance who could make the trip on a clear Saturday in October. Maggie had been baking for 2 days.
She baked with the focused efficiency she brought to all serious work. And the result was 3 dozen biscuits and 2 loaves. And a pan of dried apple cake that used the last of the apples from the cellar but was worth it. And she packed everything into cloths and into the wagon bed, with the care of a woman sending something she had made into a room that was going to have opinions about it. She did not know what was in Harriet Crane's letters, but she knew enough. She had known enough since June. She said nothing to Caleb because she was not certain she was right about it and because there was nothing to be done if she was. She had made a decision sometime in the summer. In the long, slow accumulation of it, she was not going to live differently because of what people like Harriet Crane were prepared to say about her. She had lived differently because of that for the better part of a year in Laramie, performing at the edges of her life to accommodate other people's opinions. And she had learned in that year that it cost more than the thing it was supposed to protect her from. She would go to the social. She would bring bread. She would not explain herself. The hall was warm and full when they arrived. The harvest decorations on the walls and the tables laden, and the whole valley talking at once, in the way that people talk when they have been largely winter separate for a season and have things to account for. Maggie set up her contributions in the kitchen and came out to the main hall and met the people she had not yet met and was met by them in return with the range of welcome she had expected, warm from some, cautious from others. 1 or 2 who looked at her with the particular expression that meant they had read a letter recently. The boys were with the other children along the side wall. Thomas had his sketchbook tucked under the back of his chair. Peter had found 2 friends inside 10 minutes and was explaining something to them with considerable energy. The Cranes arrived at 8. She did not go still when she saw them come in. She had been waiting for them and was ready. Harriet was in blue silk again. Of course she was. She crossed the room in the way she crossed rooms, and people made way for her. And she greeted the banker's wife, and the doctor's wife, and the preacher's wife, in turn, working the room with the ease of a woman in her natural element. And all the while Maggie tracked her in the way you track a weather system from a window. The moment came at 8:40. Maggie had gone back to the kitchen to bring out the bread pan, the last thing, the bread still warm from the cloths. She came through the kitchen doorway into the main hall, both hands on the pan, and she heard it begin. Harriet Crane was standing beside the refreshment table. She had timed it. Of course she had timed it. The position, the angle, the volume. Everything placed so that when Maggie came through that door, she would be facing the room, and the room would be facing her, and Harriet would be standing in the space between them, speaking. Already speaking in that voice that was perfectly calibrated to reach every corner without appearing to try. She spoke about Edmund Holt with the gentleness of a woman very much concerned. The gambling, the debt, the specific establishment in Laramie where the specific events had occurred. She had done her research thoroughly. Maggie could feel the precision of it, the detail that could only come from someone who had sent a letter and received an answer. And then the additional fact. The one that was technically true and entirely misleading, that Maggie had remained in Laramie for several months after Edmund's death, in a situation that, for a woman alone, without legal protection, here, Harriet paused. Let the room fill the blank. Raised questions that a man in Caleb Rourke's position would surely wish to have answered before. The word arrangement, the word unsuitable. The room had gone very quiet. 40 people standing in the Larkspur Church Hall in October. And every one of them watching Maggie Holt stand in a kitchen doorway with a tin bread pan in her hands. She did not move. She looked at Harriet Crane. And for 1 full second, she let herself see exactly what was there. A woman who had done something cold-blooded and thorough, and was performing concern about it with considerable skill. And then she looked away from her. Not down, not sideways. She looked at the bread pan in her hands.
She crossed to the nearest table. She set the bread pan down with both hands flat, the cloth smoothed where it had folded at the corner.
She straightened it. She took her time with it. She was aware of every eye in the room, and she gave them nothing to see except a woman setting down a bread pan with care. Then she turned and walked toward the door. She did not look at Harriet Crane. She did not explain herself. Through the side window as she passed she saw Peter Rourke standing alone at the wagon in the cold. He had come outside. He was standing very still, both arms at his sides. And his face had the particular expression of a 9-year-old boy who has understood something he had not wanted to understand, that adults could construct cruelty from facts, the way a carpenter constructs something from good wood. Something that looks solid and holds together and functions precisely as intended, and that there is no defense against it except to keep walking. She pushed the door open and walked out. The October air hit her face. Cold and clear and indifferent. Mrs. Holt. She stopped. Peter was looking at her. The wagon was 10 feet from the door, and he had been standing at the wheel, and he was looking at her with that expression that had not changed since. She'd seen it through the window. "Go back inside. Peter," she said. "I heard what she said. I know you did." She came down the church steps. "Go back inside. It's cold." "It's not true." He said it with the simple certainty of a child who has lived in a house with a person for a year, and knows what they know. What she said isn't true. She looked at him. The lamplight from the hall windows was reaching him through the glass, and the look on his face was the one she had seen in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, the one that had decided she was worth something before she had proved it. "Some of it is," she said honestly. She would not lie to him. "Some of it isn't." "The part about you isn't true," he said. She put her hand on the top of his head briefly, the way she had not allowed herself to do before. And then she moved it and she said, "Go inside and find your brother. Tell him I said good night." "Are you coming back?" She did not answer him. She looked at the road that went south toward Larkspur and east toward Laramie. And she felt in her bag for the wages she had folded there this morning before she'd known she would need them. And the amount was what she had calculated it was. "Go inside, Peter," she said. He went. She walked to the road. She stood at the edge of it in the dark and looked south. The road to Larkspur was 2 miles, and there was a stage that ran twice weekly, and she knew the schedule. If she was in Larkspur before 10, she could make arrangements and be on the stage by morning, and be in Laramie by nightfall. She calculated this. She did the arithmetic of it, the way she had been doing the arithmetic of things her entire life. What was needed, what was available, what the distance was between them. She heard the church hall door behind her. One set of footsteps. She knew them. She did not turn around. He came to stand beside her, not close, the appropriate distance. She was aware of him, in the way she had been aware of him for months. The particular quality of the space he occupied. "Come back to the ranch," he said. Quiet. No performance in it, just the words. "No," she said. He did not move. "You defended me in there," she said. "In June, when Crane said what he said. Dora told me." She looked at the south road. "I know you'd do it again tonight. I know that's who you are." She paused. "But I will not go back there, as a woman you are keeping out of decency. I will not be a charity." Her voice was steady. She had steadied it with intention. "I have been that. Before you. I was that in Laramie for the year I stayed after Edmund. And I am not going back to that." She turned to look at him, then, directly. "Not even in a good house with a good man." He looked at her. She had learned to read him across a year of mornings and evenings and lamplit tables, and she read him now the set of his jaw, the particular quality of the stillness around his eyes when he was working something out. "All right," he said. 2 words, she had been counting. He turned and walked back to the hall. She turned back to the road. She stood there with the dark around her and the sound of the hall behind her, and the cold October air, and the south road running out in front of her toward Larkspur and Laramie.
And she held the tin bread pan in her mind, still on the table, in there. Exactly where she had left it, and she breathed.
She did not know what he was going to do. She did not know what was happening inside that hall.
She stood at the road in the October dark, and she waited. Caleb Rourke was not a man who spoke in public.
He had attended the Harvest Social for 11 consecutive years, and had said across all of them, approximately 40 words in the company of more than 10 people at once.
And none of those 40 words had been about himself. He was known in the Bighorn Valley as a man of considerable land and complete reticence. And the two things had the easy relationship of things that belong together.
He stood up from his chair.
The sound of it was small, the scrape of chair legs on the wood floor, but it reached across the room. And the conversations nearest to him slowed and then stopped. And the stopping spread outward the way ripples spread from a stone dropped in still water.
Until the hall was quiet and 40 people were looking at a man who had stood up at a social event and was therefore presumably going to say something. He did not look at Harriet Crane. He looked at the far wall, the way a man looks when he is going to say true things and needs to keep his accounting straight.
"I want to say something," he said. The room waited. "Maggie Holt came to my ranch last October," he said.
"I put an advertisement in the territorial paper, and she answered it, and she came. That's the full extent of what I arranged.
She came to work, and she worked."
He paused.
He was not a man who used pauses for effect. He used them to get the next sentence right. "She found my kitchen with 3 weeks of flour left, and no lard, and a stove that needed the flue cleaned.
And she restocked the shelves with her own money before she told me she'd done it. And she cleaned the flue. And every morning since then, the kitchen has been running before I'm up, and the house has been different for it."
The hall did not stir. "My boys," he said. He stopped, started again. "My boys have been without their mother for 2 years. I am not going to stand here and tell you I handled that correctly. I handled it the way a man handles something he doesn't know how to handle. Which is by working and being present and not managing much else. She came in October, and by December Peter was downstairs before 5 in the morning, because he could not stay away from the kitchen.
And by January, Thomas was bringing his sketchbook in and sitting at the work table while she worked. And by March he was drawing again. He looked at the floor briefly.
He had not drawn people before this winter. He drew her. The room was absolutely silent.
"I am not going to argue with what has been said here tonight,"
Caleb continued. "I am not going to tell you what Maggie Holt is or is not, because she is standing outside at this moment, and I expect she will do that herself if she chooses to, and she won't if she doesn't, and either way is her right." He looked up at the room. "What I'm going to tell you is what I know,
which is that she has worked hard for a year and earned every cent I've paid her, and has not asked for anything beyond it. And that my house is a different place than it was. And that is what I came here to say." He stopped. It was not a long speech. It was not an eloquent one. It was the speech of a man who had said the exact things he meant to say in the exact order he meant to say them, which was the only kind of speech he knew how to make. The room was still working out what to do with the silence, when the side door opened. Peter Rourke walked into the hall.
He had come around the outside of the building, from the direction of the wagon, and he came in through the side door that opened near the kitchen.
And he walked to the center of the room. He was in his good shirt that had gotten cold from being outside, and his hair was pushed back from his face. And he was 9 years old, and he knew it, and he was there anyway. He looked at his father. Then he looked at the room. Not at Harriet Crane specifically. Not at anyone specifically. He looked at the room the way a 9-year-old boy looks at a room when he has something to say and has decided it needs saying.
"She gets up before us," he said. "Every morning. Since the first week. So the kitchen's warm when we come down." He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true. Not defending it. Not arguing for it. Stating it, the way you state the direction of north or the temperature of water. Because it is what it is, and someone in this room did not appear to know it and need it to.
He paused.
"Then, she's the reason Thomas talks at supper again." Behind him. In the doorway, he had come through. Thomas Rourke stood with his sketchbook tucked under his arm, watching the room. He did not come in. He did not say anything. He stood in the doorway in his good shirt with his charcoal dark hands at his sides, and his presence in that doorway said everything that the words had not. The hall was completely still. Harriet Crane was standing beside the refreshment table in her blue silk, and her face had done something she had not allowed it to do in this room or any other room. In Maggie Holt's presence, it had gone unmanaged. The calculation she was accustomed to wearing like a second garment had slipped, and what was under it was small and cold, and aware that something had gone wrong with the plan. And there was nowhere to put that awareness where it would not be seen. She looked at her husband. Sylvester Crane was examining the floor. At the side door, Dora Alcott stood with her hands folded in front of her, watching. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been waiting a considerable time for something, and has now seen it, and is satisfied in the deep, quiet way of people who have been right about things for long enough that satisfaction does not require a performance. The preacher's wife said something to the preacher in a low voice. The banker looked at the refreshment table. The schoolteacher looked at her hands. Ruth Alcott, from the north side of the valley, who had known both families for 8 years, and had read Harriet Crane correctly from the first time she met her, turned to her husband and said, not particularly quietly, "Well, that's that." Caleb walked to the side door. He put his hand briefly on Peter's shoulder as he passed, brief and certain, the way he did things that mattered. He walked through. Thomas stepped aside. The side door closed behind him. She heard the door. She turned from the road. He was coming around the side of the building, his coat open against the cold, and she could see him in the lamplight from the windows. And she could read him the way she had learned to read him, and what she read was not a man who had come to offer charity. He stopped at a distance that was not far. "What did you say in there?" she asked. "What I said." She waited. "I said what the ranch was before October, and what it's been since." He looked at her, and Peter came in. She was still. "He said you get up before them every morning." Caleb said. "So the kitchen's warm." A pause. "He said you're the reason Thomas talks at supper." She looked down at the road beneath her feet. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying required a surplus of safety that she had not been able to afford. And the habit had become the fact. And the fact had held. But something happened in the back of her throat that required a moment. Thomas was in the doorway, Caleb said, behind Peter. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. She looked up. "I know this isn't the right road for you," he said. "I know the South Road and the stage and Laramie. I know you calculated it while you were standing here." He said it without judgment. "You're good at the arithmetic of things. I've watched you do it for a year." She said nothing. "What I'm asking you to consider," he said, and his voice was the voice he used for things that cost him, the quiet voice under the quiet voice, "is whether the arithmetic has anything in it that you actually want." She stood at the road. She thought about the bread pan on the table in that hall. She thought about Thomas in the doorway with his sketchbook. She thought about Peter saying, "She's the reason Thomas talks at supper," in a room full of adults, 9 years old, in his good shirt that had gotten cold. She thought about the kitchen in the dark before 5 in the morning, the stove going, the bread in the oven, the sound of small feet on the stairs. She thought about the bench, the porch, the valley going gold in the evening light. One day, she thought. Then the next, "There's a bread pan on that table in there," she said. "I know. I'd like it back." He turned and went back to the hall. She stood at the road, and she breathed the October air, and she let the feeling stand where it was without managing it. Just for a moment, just the length of time it took for the side door of the Larkspur Church Hall to open and close, and for Caleb Rourke to walk across the yard toward her with the tin bread pan in both hands, carried carefully, the cloth still folded over it the way she had left it. He held it out. She took it. The tin was still faintly warm through the cloth. She stood there with the bread pan in her hands, and looked at him. She did not explain herself. For the first time in as long as she could remember. She did not need to. "Let's go home," she said. The kitchen was cold when they got back. The boys had fallen asleep in the wagon on the ride, and Caleb carried them in one at a time, still in their good shirts. And Dora appeared and managed the rest of it, in the efficient way Dora managed things that needed managing. And Maggie went to the kitchen and lit the stove. She set the bread pan on the shelf above the stove. She stood there a moment with her hand on the warming iron and the kitchen going from cold to less cold around her. And she listened to the house settling in the October night. And she thought about nothing she could not afford to think. The door from the hall opened. Caleb came in and sat down at the table. The bread pan was on the shelf, the lamp was lit, the stove was beginning to answer. He sat in the chair he always sat in and he looked at the table and then he looked at her.
And he was a man who did not dress things up, and she was a woman who did not require them dressed. And they were both aware of this about each other. In the way you are aware of things that have been true for a long time, and have finally become possible to say. He said one sentence. She heard it. She stood at the stove with her hands at her sides and she looked at him across the kitchen and the lamp and the bread pan and the year of mornings and evenings and lamplit tables and Thomas's drawings on the wall and Peter at the pump with 2 full buckets and the porch bench and the valley going gold. She said yes. It was the simplest word she had said in a year, and it was the truest.
The ceremony was in the parlor on a Saturday in November, with a circuit preacher named Aldous, who had been riding the Bighorn territory for 14 years and did not require anything to be more than it was. Dora stood to the left in her best dress that she had owned for 12 years and would own for 12 more.
And her expression was the expression of a woman who has watched a household come back to life and is allowing herself, on this one occasion, the full measure of what that costs to feel. Peter stood straight and did not fidget, which he had clearly decided in advance he was going to manage. And was managing. At considerable personal effort, Thomas stood beside him with his hands at his sides, and his sketchbook not in his arms for once, and his face was the face of a boy who had decided, sometime in the previous year, in the dark before 5 in the morning, when the bread smell came down through the floor of his room, that this was something worth deciding, in favor of. The preacher said what needed saying. Caleb said his part, in the voice he used for things that mattered, which was quiet and direct and unornamented. And she thought, yes, that is exactly it.
She said her part, looking at him the way she had learned to look at things she intended to keep directly, without protecting herself from the sight of them. When it was done, Peter said, finally, under his breath, in a tone that suggested he had been waiting a considerable time. And Thomas elbowed him. And Dora made a sound that she converted at the last moment into a cough. And Caleb looked at his sons with an expression that had not been on his face in 2 years, and which, once it was there, appeared to have decided it was staying. 2 weeks later, a letter came from Laramie. 3 men, their names on it. The debt of $412. Edmund Holt's widow. Caleb read it at the kitchen table. He wrote a reply at the same table that evening. He sealed it and put it in the mail pouch the next morning. And the reply contained a bank draft for the full amount and 3 sentences. And the last of those sentences was the last sentence that would ever be written on the subject of Edmund Holt's debts. He did not mention it to Maggie at supper. She found out from Dora. As she found out most things, in the matter-of-fact way Dora delivered information she considered settled. She went to find him in the barn. He was at the workbench with the bridle that needed mending. And he did not look up when she came in. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. Caleb, he set the bridle down. He looked at her across the barn with the November light coming through the door behind her. It's done, he said. That's all. She stood there a moment. Then she nodded. She went back to the kitchen. She put both hands flat on the work table and looked at the drawings on the wall. The horse, the creek, the valley, the barn. Dora's hands, the view from the upstairs window, and the tin bread pan rendered in charcoal with its dent and its scorched corner and M.H. in the rim. She looked at them for a long time. One day, she thought, then the next, then all the days after that, in a house that was hers, in a valley that was learning her name, with 2 boys who came down the stairs before 5 in the morning, because they could not stay away from the smell of bread baking, and a man who had handed her back a bread pan in a cold October yard and said, come home, without any fanfare,
because it was simply what was true.
The Larkspur Harvest Social came around the following October. She baked for 2 days, 3 dozen biscuits and 2 loaves and the dried apple cake again. Because the apples had been good this year, better than last, and the recipe was worth repeating, she packed everything in cloths and put it in the wagon and carried the tin bread pan last, wrapped in the cloth she always used, and set it in the wagon bed with both hands. The hall was warm and full when they arrived. The same harvest decorations, the same tables, the same valley gathered, ranchers and townspeople and the schoolteacher and the preacher and his family.
The whole ordinary machinery of a community that runs on seasons and harvests, and the small ceremonies of people who live within sight of each other's smoke. The cranes were not there. The railroad had gotten its right-of-way through the East Valley of the next county. Dora had told her in August, which meant the surveying of Rourke's Fork was no longer commercially interesting, which meant Sylvester Crane's interest in the Bighorn foothills had concluded, which meant Harriet Crane's interest in it had concluded, and neither of them had been seen in Larkspur since April. Maggie set up her contributions in the kitchen and carried the bread pan out to the main hall and set it on the center table, the same table she had set it on the year before. She straightened the cloth. She looked up. Ruth Alcott was coming toward her from across the hall, with the direct purposefulness of a woman who has been waiting all year to say hello and has been patient long enough.
The preacher's wife was right behind her. The Hendricks woman from the North Valley, 3 others she recognized from the previous October and from the intervening year of church Sundays and supply days in Larkspur.
Coming toward her, not at her. The difference was the whole world. Mrs. Rourke, Ruth said, and took both her hands. It is very good to see you. Maggie looked at the hall around her, the lamplight on the gathered faces, the tables, the decorations, the window through which, 1 year ago, she had seen a 9-year-old boy standing alone at the wagon, understanding something he did not want to understand. She looked at the bread pan on the center table, at the indentation in the right side, at the scorched corner, at the cloth folded the way she always folded it. Her hands had flour on them still, from the 2 days of baking, from the morning, from the particular residue of real work that does not entirely wash off, that stays in the creases of the knuckles and the lines of the palm, and says, "This is what I have been doing. This is what I am for." She looked at the bread pan with its initials in the rim, and she thought about her mother's kitchen, and the morning the pan had become hers, and everything that had traveled between that morning and this one, the cities and the stages and the kitchens, and the debts, and the year in Laramie, and the advertisement in the territorial paper, and the stage north into the Bighorn foothills, and the house on the rise in the valley with the smoke from the kitchen chimney. She thought about a boy at the bottom of the stairs in the dark, drawn by the smell of bread. She thought about the sound of 2 sets of boots coming down from the upper floor every morning before 5. Because they could not stay away, she looked at the hall around her. The same room, the same table, the same bread pan. She was not the same woman who had carried it through that kitchen doorway a year ago. She was not the woman who had set it down with both hands and smoothed the cloth, and turned and walked to the door. She was not going to the door. She put her flour-covered hands flat on the table, one on either side of the bread pan, and she looked at this room, that had tried to make her small and had not managed it. And she felt the warmth of the hall and the solid wood of the table under her palms, and the weight of the year behind her. All of it, and she thought, well, here I am. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. Across the hall, Caleb was talking to the Hendricks rancher with his coat still on, because he had not yet thought to take it off, which was his habit. Peter was already 3 conversations into the evening, visible near the side door, talking with the energy of a 10-year-old who has had a year's worth of things to say saved up and is beginning the disbursement. Thomas was standing at the window with his sketchbook under his arm, looking at the room with the focused attention of a boy who was going to draw this later. All of it, the lamplight and the tables, and the gathered faces, and the bread pan in the center. She knew, without having to look, that what he was going to draw was her, hands on the table, flour on the knuckles, standing in the room like she belonged to it. Because she did.
One day, she thought. Then the next, then all the days after that. For as long as Wyoming had winters, and the bread pan had its initials, and the kitchen had its shelf above the stove, for as long as there were boys who came down the stairs in the dark because they could not stay away from the smell of something warm, that was the whole of it, that was. In every way that mattered, more than enough,